Hello friends, let us talk about the poem Tintern Abbey written by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth and his bosom friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge are the two great names in Romantic poetry, and they are known as the older or the early Romantic poets. Of course, I should not leave out the name of William Blake, who was an illustrious contemporary, but William Blake's poetry stands a class apart, and it is usually not classified as a Romantic poetry. The Romantic period was preceded by the Neoclassical era, and we had great names like Samuel Johnson, Edmund Burke, Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, William Cowper, William Collins, Oliver Goldsmith, and the list goes on. And when it came to the Romantic period, this was an age of revolution, not only in literature but also in politics and philosophy. The ideas put forward by great philosophers like Rousseau, Voltaire, Kant, Burke and Hume had fired the imagination of the thinking public. And this was the time when people started discussing about the need for democracy, and the individual was given a lot of importance. There was a lot of emphasis laid on individuality and freedom. And this again was the time when we had the French Revolution. The French Revolution, we know, took place in 1789, just a few years before what we call the Romantic period started. And the French Revolution, the ideals of the French Revolution, equality, liberty, and the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality and fraternity, they inspired these ideals, set the hearts of young men afire, and it kind of inspired them into great thoughts. And it is said that Wordsworth, who was a young man then, even went over to France in order to be a part of the revolutionary experience. So that was the time when the Romantic poetry came in, and it was there was a general tendency to go against everything that was established as correct and as good by the previous era. So the writers and the thinkers and the philosophers, they tried to revolt against accepted traditions and customs and conventions. The same thing happened in literature too. And let me just quickly tell you about the characteristic features of Romantic poetry. For one, a lot of prominence was given to the idea of spontaneity. They believed that poetry and art, for that matter, should be spontaneous. As Wordsworth said about poetry, this is something that all of you must be familiar with. This is what he said about poetry, that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. And Keats said about poetry, if poetry comes not as naturally as leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. So that was one thing these people insisted on: spontaneity, natural feelings. Yet another feature was that there was a general mood and a temper of strong passion, sensibility, aspiration and melancholy. And literature began to exhibit a love of nature and the rustic. And poetry and novels were written about ordinary people, about people, peasants, and about villagers, about, as we see in Wordsworth, a little girl called Lucy Gray, or a nameless peasant girl singing in the fields, a solitary reaper. Poetry began to center on the sights in nature, as in Daffodils. Or you had Robert Burns even writing a poem about a little mouse. So that was a drastic change in comparison to the earlier period. And Romantic literature also displayed a love of the wild, the fantastic and the supernatural. And the romantic writers like Keats and Coleridge, they were very much inspired by the tales of the medieval age about knights, the chivalrous knights and mysterious damsels and frightening monsters. So there was a renewed interest in myths and the stories of the medieval age, and also, as I mentioned earlier, a love for the wild and the fantastic and the supernatural. And it was Coleridge who steeped his poetry in what you would call the supernatural. In most of his poems, you find an element of the supernatural, but you would find less so in Wordsworth. The Romantic period roughly begins somewhere around 1785. Some like to believe that the formal takeoff or the formal beginning of the Romantic era happened with the publication of the lyrical ballads in 1798. And you know that the lyrical ballads is it's a compilation of poetry written by Wordsworth and Coleridge. The greater number of poems were written by Wordsworth, and Coleridge contributed a few of his. And so this is believed, so this year 1798 is important when we talk about the Romantic age, because that is believed to be the year in which Romantic age started. Now coming to Wordsworth, he was born in 1770 on April 7th at this place called Cockermouth in the Lake District. He spent his childhood in the very rustic surroundings of his home. He was orphaned by at the age of 13. He had a few siblings, sisters and brothers, and he was later his guardians who took over charge of him. His guardians later sent him to St. John's College, Cambridge. He started writing poems. He met Coleridge in 1796, and that was the beginning of a wonderful and a very fruitful kind of a friendship. He married Mary Hutchinson in 1802. They moved to the place called Grasmere along with his sister Dorothy, and they spent a very happy time there. They used to take long walks all over the countryside, and in the beginning his writing was not very well received. He was quite unhappy about that, but then slowly things turned around in his favor. The new generation especially began to enjoy his poetry, and his readership steadily increased. He became famous, and on the death of Robert Southey, Wordsworth was nominated to be the Poet Laureate, and this was in the year 1843. And Wordsworth died in 1850, just before he was 80 years old. Now coming to this poem, Tintern Abbey, this is a poem that is included in the lyrical ballads, and it is a poem that reveals Wordsworth's immense love for nature, and he considered nature to be an embodiment of the divine spirit. He held a pantheistic view of God, meaning to say that he saw an element of God in everything in nature, whether it is a tree or a leaf, or the rainbow, or the cataract, or the waterfall. He saw nature he saw God in everything, and he felt or he perceived in them a celestial light and an indescribable aura of glory. And he believed that nature is a great teacher, and that the union is possible between the indwelling soul of the universe and the individual soul of man. And he believed that the union of the two would lead to ultimate happiness. Now, coming to this particular poem specifically, let me tell you about what he has mentioned. Wordsworth himself has said about this. I'll just read a few lines. Wordsworth says, "No poem of mine was composed under circumstances more pleasant for me to remember than this. I began it upon leaving Tintern after crossing the Wye, and concluded it just after crossing the Wye. Not a line of it was altered, and not any part of it written down till I reached Bristol. It was published immediately after. Okay, so in this poem, there is no intermediary narrator. The poet is directly addressing the reader, and this poem is also considered to be a kind of a homework or a preliminary sketch of the prelude, which is considered to be his spiritual autobiography. Now let me tell you about the setting of the poem. It is set in the place called Tintern Abbey. Now Tintern is a village on the west bank of the River Wye in South Wales. It's near a place called Monmouthshire in South Wales, and it is close to the border with England. And an abbey is a place, it's a complex of buildings used by the members of a religious order, including the church and the place where these people stayed, and the chapel, and all that together was called an abbey. And usually an abbey was governed by an abbot or an abbess. Okay. Now this particular abbey, called the Tintern Abbey, was built in 1131 at the time of Henry I. And then it was, over the years, it was built and rebuilt many times, and it was large enough to house almost 400 monks at a time. So the abbey, which was started or which was built in 1131, remained in operation till almost 1536. And then what happened in 1536? It was the time of Henry VIII, and he ordered the dissolution of all monasteries in 1536. And between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII disbanded all monasteries, and he confiscated their property and the wealth. So that is history. Now then, what happened later to Tintern Abbey was that it fell into ruins. And now coming to the title, so I've told you about about this place called Tintern Abbey. Now let me go on to tell you a few things about the title. Now, for convenience sake, this poem is generally called Tintern Abbey, but then the full title is a very long one. I'll read the title to you. This is the full title of the poem. Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13th, 1798. It's a pretty long title and difficult to remember too, and that is why it is known as the Tintern Abbey. But then students of literature, especially who are doing a detailed study of this poem, should definitely know that this is the full title. And the title, it reveals the poem's perspective on the abbey, because it is said here that these are lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. So it reveals that the poem's perspective on the abbey is quite elevated. He is looking at it from somewhere above, and it is distant and maybe even detached. And what else do we get from this title? It tells us that he is revisiting the place after 5 years, on revisiting the banks of the Wye. So that means this is year 1798, and so he had visited the same place in 1793. And again, it is a part of a tour. During a tour, he says. And I told you that this place is in South Wales. It's not anywhere near where Wordsworth lived, and so it is a part of a tour. And he also specifically mentions the date of composition, July 13th, 1798. So this many details you get from the title itself. And as we read the poem, we also understand that the man who visited the place in 1793 is not the man who is revisiting the place now in 1798. A lot of changes have occurred to him as a person, and in due course of the poem we will be looking at the changes that happened to him.